Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So on behalf of the Russell Sage Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and Princeton University, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Summer Institutes in Computational Social Science. Hello to everyone here in Princeton. Hello to everyone at the partner locations. And hello to everyone tuning in on the live stream. It's my great pleasure to welcome our guest speaker today, Eric Schwartz. Eric is the editorial director at Columbia University Press. And before he was at Columbia, he was at Princeton University Press, where I was lucky enough to have the great chance to work with him. So the beginning of Bit by Bit happened with Eric. And I know Chris also had the great privilege of working with Eric when he was at Princeton University Press. So I think we're very fortunate to have someone who has a broad view of the publishing space and also has specific domain knowledge in our areas of computational social science. So it is our pleasure to welcome Eric. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Matt. So thank you all for coming today, and thanks to Matt and Chris for having me here. The honor is definitely mine in being able to work with the both of them. They're great, and I've had the opportunity to see them develop this boot camp over the past few years, and it's really impressive. And the global reach of it is also pretty incredible. So thanks for this great opportunity. So I'm going to talk with you a bit about how to publish a book with a university press. As Matt mentioned, I'm the editorial director for Columbia University Press. And in general, university presses are kind of a particular type of category of publishing, and a particular category I think that is particularly useful for people who are doing academic work that you expect to reach an audience within the academic community. So the first, I think, important question really is, what is a university press? What makes a university press different from another type of publisher? So the first component is that university press is the nonprofit scholarly publishing arm of a university or college. So I'm actually an employee of Columbia University. Columbia University Press is a unit of Columbia University, and this is the case for most university presses. Some have kind of independent relationships, so Princeton University Press, for instance, is actually an independent 501(c), but there are formal and informal ways in which it's part of the university. But nevertheless, Princeton University recognizes Princeton University Press as its kind of house publisher, as its publisher. And so that's the first element is the connection to a university or college. The second, and I think this is the really important element, is peer review. So every book that's published by a university press, regardless of what kind of book it is, it could be from a world famous scientist to a revised dissertation, to a book that's meant for a purely popular audience, to a book that is a textbook for courses. Every book is going to get an external peer review, typically with 2 outside readers, and that the book, in order to be published and issued a contract, will be reviewed and approved by a publications committee or faculty board of the university. We have a faculty board of 10 faculty members. They meet the last Thursday of every month, and any book that we want to publish, no matter what, has to be approved by this body. And that's, I think, an important element that why people within the academy trust books that are published by university presses, because they have that imprint of peer review. And university press, as I mentioned before, can do a whole wide range of things, from scholarly books to journals to digital publications, things that are original research, things that are synthetic and can be used for course teaching, and also same thing, books for a popular audience as well. So there's a wide range of types of publications. So what is the business climate at the moment for university presses? I would say it's not particularly great. If you've been following the news at all at the moment, Stanford University Press is under a lot of strains, and I think this is sort of indicative of a problem that exists right now within the university press publishing community, which is primarily driven by the fact that the sales environment at the moment is very unpredictable. So for decades, the university press could more or less count on a university libraries to buy, I don't know, 1,000 copies. I've been working in publishing since 1995, and that number has just steadily decreased and decreased and decreased to the point where, maybe you'll sell 150 copies. So you really can't rely on that university library market. And there are also, there are fewer and fewer bookstores. The bookstores that exist, the independents are robust, but there aren't as many of them as there used to be. There isn't a Borders anymore. Barnes & Noble is getting sold to an investment firm. So there's a lot of difficulty within that. Amazon is a challenging partner to work with as well. And then there's strains from open access as well, particularly in the UK and Europe, where in order to get funding, there's often needs for material to be made open access. And if something is open access, then why would somebody buy copies of it? And so we're not as able to rely on the sales revenue to cover our costs. That said, costs have remained relatively stable to produce a book. A monograph, on average, based on a recent Ithaca study, costs about $40,000 to produce, and that's inclusive of all the fixed costs of production, and then also the variable costs of paper printing and binding. But paper and printing and binding, what you think of as like the physical book itself, is really only about a third of that cost. So most of the money that's spent in publishing a book is on the things like the review process, the overhead for the publisher, the marketing, going to different conferences, producing advertising material, copy editing, typesetting, cover design, all the staff that's required to do those things, the rent, you name it. So it's an expensive endeavor. And as a result, presses are reliant on more and more kind of non-book funding sources. So the majority of university presses actually get a subsidy from their university. The talk right now about the Stanford case is the $1.7 million a year that Stanford University Press gets from Stanford University, and what's to happen with that. Because if that was to disappear, Stanford would no longer be able to cover its costs. It basically would lose $1.7 million a year. So doing different kinds of creative fundraising is another avenue that a lot of university presses are moving into, ourselves included. And it's not necessarily something that we as publishers are necessarily have experience with, but we're adapting with the times. So in terms of thinking about a book for yourself as an author, and thinking about a university press as a publishing partner, what do we look for as a university press? So I think the thing that is of primacy is that we look for an innovative take on a topic. We're looking for something that is new, something that's new and different, and it really has to fit within a field. So I think that's another important element. It's something that's innovative, but it's innovative within an existent context. So the field that I work in personally is sociology, and so I go to the ASA meeting, and I'm always on the lookout for interesting and different work in the field of sociology. We look for a balance of junior, mid-career, and senior scholars. So I think a really good list is going to have kind of a diversity of people at different points of their career. And often because those different books are doing different things. And it also will lead to, I think, a list that is healthy over time. Columbia University Press has been in business for 127 years. So we kind of, we're in this for the long haul. Most university presses, the university press movement really began about 100 or so years ago. So we really kind of all look at this as being long-term, and the way to stay strong in given fields is to make sure that you're constantly working with people at different stages of their career, because those junior people are going to become the mid-career people who are going to become the senior people later on down the line. We look for good writing, and I say good writing as opposed to great writing. And I think there's an expectation that things, the work should be clear. It should be well organized and well structured. But we don't need every author to be, write like Michael Lewis. It just is not really what I think people in the academy are really trained to do. As a publisher, I think that's one of the value adds that we bring, is that we can help you make your less than good writing become good writing. We don't need everyone to be a prose stylist. And we're looking for a balance across our list of commercial and scholarly contributions. So we have particular books on our list that we know we're publishing because they're going to sell really well. The contribution is to a field, but it isn't really something that's really going to make the field move a few clicks over and move really kind of define research. But we know that the books are going to sell well. But then there are other books that we know absolutely are not going to sell at all. They're probably going to sell it to those libraries. They're written about something that is relatively narrow. There's a real barrier to entry for somebody to find the book to be of importance. But we know that is a potential award winner. That it actually may 10 years from now be a book that helps to redefine the way in which we think about a given field. And we need to make sure that, all in all, we're balancing. We have a balance on our list. So when you're thinking about becoming an author and approaching a publisher or an editor, what are the things that you need to know about your work or about your project? And I talked a little bit about this with Bill Germano, who is he was the editorial director at Routledge for a while. He was the former dean of humanities at Cooper Union, and he actually had my job in the 80s. So he's somebody who I go to all the time, and he and I were talking about this. And the idea of kind of subject, method, and intent is kind of the big three things that you should understand about your work when you're becoming an author. So it sounds very simple, but what is your book about? That's, I think, something that's really kind of crucial. And who is your book for? And those things often go hand in hand, and the way in which you would explain what your book is about is often interrelated to who the book is for. And I'm thinking about that in terms of kind of the level of the kind of language and the level of concepts that you use when thinking about your book. The method. How is the research that you've done conducted, and how is it conveyed? And is a book the best way in which you want to present that information? People who do kind of broad survey research, I find often it can be difficult for them in kind of writing a book, because in essence the argument can be conveyed in a table. And 200 pages of explaining a table is a bit of a challenge, whereas the ethnographers, and again this is related to sociology, the ethnographers write really great books, because much of what they're doing is description and analysis, and that is conveyed in the scale of book writing. And intent. Why this book? What does this book mean for you as an author? What do you wish to accomplish with this book? And there can be a wide range of reasons. It can be I want to sell 1 million copies and get on the Tonight Show, or it could be I want to get tenure. And those are both valid answers. The prior is probably more difficult than the latter, but knowing that and making sure you're clear with that is going to help you in the way in which you shape and structure your book, and are able to kind of talk about it to a publishing partner. So I think all well-written books all well-written nonfiction and books really do, I think, a number of things, and they all have certain components. setting, characters, a narrator, some example of theory or a new theory that's being presented in some way, a connection to a canon, a connection to an existent body of work, and ideally too that it's something that can be taught. The books that are really successful books for university presses are often the books that are selling 1,000 copies in the 10th year after it's been out. And the reason why that's the case is because they just get adopted in courses. And they aren't necessarily books that are written as textbooks, but they just have some elements. And I think this list of elements is an example of things that make it easy to be able to communicate new ideas to new readers who haven't encountered this material before. So what should you consider when you're submitting a proposal or a manuscript to a publisher? And we as publishers receive projects in two different states. So you can write a proposal and have a sample chapter or two and submit that to a publisher, or you can write your complete manuscript and submit that to the publisher. I recommend the prior for a variety of reasons, and we can talk about that later if you like. But what should you think about when you're submitting to a publisher? The first component is fit. And by fit, I mean, does this project fit the list of the publisher that you're communicating with? So for instance, at Columbia University Press, we don't have an editor who covers anthropology. So when we get projects that are submitted that are by anthropologists, we often say that we don't think this project is appropriate for us because we don't actually have a list in your field. And what that means is that we don't have then the infrastructure to support books that are in a field that we don't cover. We don't go to the anthropology meeting, for instance. We're not embedded within that field and meeting with different authors, and we may not necessarily be up on what is the latest within that field. So when you're thinking about a publisher, go to the publisher's website, look at their list of editors, their list of catalogs, look at their general catalog and see what are they putting up at the front of their catalog, what are they showing that they really think is the most important work. And that's going to be a good indicator for you. Another way to think about fit also is like look at your shelf. What are the books that are on your shelf? Who has published those books? And that might be a good example. I would say also too, it's important to think about relatively recent. So maybe within the last 5 years or so. Presses lists will change over time, often due to the retirement or an editor leaving. And that's then an opportunity to make some kind of strategic shifts. So for instance, Columbia had a very strong classics list in, I think, like the 1960s. But we don't have a classics list any longer. So if somebody was to submit a project to us in classics, it just really wouldn't be a fit for the same reason that I described before. So fit is essential. Audience. What is the audience that your book is for? What is the level of readership? Is this a book that is for a general reader, undergraduates? Is it a book that's for graduate students and scholars in a field? Again, there's no right or wrong answer to this, but be very clear in what you are expecting. The writing style, I always recommend that people write at the level of an upper level undergraduate. The reason being is that these are students who have decided that they care enough about the topic to take the course, but they don't necessarily know everything about it and need to be kind of guided along. And it also then allows you, I think, too, to use jargon that is appropriate and common within your field, but not have a prose that's just littered with kind of all kinds of very technical terminology. With a book, you have that potential to reach audiences beyond just your given subfield or your given field, and you should really take advantage of that if you can. The pitch is really important, and I think this is really kind of crucial and something that will carry through your book over a duration of time, you should be able to describe your book in basically 1 or 2 sentences. And the reason being is that kind of 1-2 sentence pitch will actually carry throughout the whole process, to the point where, you know, when my colleague and Publicity and I go to meet with the editor of the New York Review of Books, she's very frequently uttering that 1-sentence pitch to the editor there to see if we can get them to be interested in, you know, getting a copy for review and assigning it. So it's really essential. It also really, I think, helps you to kind of clarify. The exercise of creating that 1 or 2 sentence pitch really helps you to clarify what it is that you're doing. Flexibility is essential. So your book will be reviewed by multiple peer reviewers. So you're going to get peer reviewer comments and feedback, and you're going to need to be able to adapt to those questions and comments. The peer review for books is not quite the same as it is for journal articles. So we don't treat peer review in quite the same level of kind of gatekeeper function as in articles. I mean, you shouldn't. The goal is not to revise and resubmit. You know, we don't take on projects or even consider them for review if we don't think that they're worthwhile and our ultimate goal is to publish them. And you have more opportunity within a peer review because in a book peer review to be able to contest what the different reviewers are saying. So it isn't a case where the book will be published once you adopt all the changes that are requested. But you should be able to have flexibility and you know, take advice from an editor. An editor can help you, your marketing person can help you, your production staff can help you. It's a collaborative process and there's a lot of feedback that you're going to get. So be prepared for that to come. Funding, if you have a project that requires you know, very kind of expensive production components, then you should be prepared to be able to find some way to help defray those costs. You know, the person who, you know, art historians, I think, really have a particular type of problem with this, where they need to be able to reproduce 4-color art, and they need to get permission for that, and often the permission may go to multiple different locations. And so, if you do have anything that's tricky, be prepared for a way to kind of help out with that. And finally, communication. It's not the case with books that you can submit to only one publisher. I generally recommend to authors, especially first-time authors, that you try to meet a number of editors and really kind of use that proposal period as a kind of an opportunity to see which editors are you getting along with, who really gets the project, and you know, where is the fit for you going to be best. And just let those editors know that, you know, I've also submitted this to NYU, I've also submitted this to Harvard, and that way everybody is kind of on the same page. The relationship between the kind of editor and author is really built on trust, and I think that's a great way to kind of get that trust relationship started. And just because you know, in the case you leave a press, and a new editor takes over, you know, you still have, I think in the case of like Matt and I and Chris and I, you still have a strong relationship with authors over time. We're all part of the same ecosystem, and I think it's really, you know, those trust relationships are really important. Okay, so book proposal components. So more or less every book proposal is kind of structured in the same type of way. The proposal guidelines that we have on our website at Columbia are ones that I actually took from me when I was at Princeton, and they were actually the ones that I took with me when I was at Cambridge before that. So we know at least the 3 of them have the same guidelines. So first thing, proposed title and subtitle. Very rarely is a title the same on a proposal as it is on a published book. Subtitles are also, for academic books, can be really important. I mean, think about things like search optimization, but you also want a title that's going to be interesting and catchy. You don't want a title that's been used before. The title of a book that, I mean, if you think about like kind of somebody types in a title in Amazon, you don't want them to, pull up like a John Grisham novel. So you want to make sure that your thing is going to come up first. A great way to think about title-subtitle relationship is that the title is the question, or is the answer, and the subtitle is the question. That's a kind of a structure that I recommend to people. It doesn't have to be that way, but it's a good way to start thinking. So title is the answer, subtitle is the question. A brief description of the book, 1 or 2 paragraphs. Think about this as if you were writing jacket copy. So this is written more or less for anyone who's at the publisher. The publicist, the marketing director, in all likelihood, they're the people who are going to focus on this 1 to 2 page description. And what you're basically doing is providing some level of context and interest-grabbing material at the top, posing what the question the book is asking and what the answer to that question is, and how is that work done and who's the audience. That's just a real kind of simple way. And if you look at enough jacket copy, you'll see that it more or less follows a very similar kind of pattern to that. A full description is then 1 or 2 pages, and think about this as if you were writing to a colleague. So this is where it's going to have the similar structure as the 1 to 2 paragraph version, but you can really expand it a lot more and get more into the details. And this is the thing that peer reviewers are going to focus on more. Chapter outline. So what is the structure of the book? What are the different chapters? A brief paragraph or so about what each of these chapters are doing. Ultimately, a book is a single argument. And each of those chapters is helping you to be able to provide evidence in support of the answer to the question that your book is asking. It's defending your argument. So each of those chapters should have a purpose to them. And this is where you can help to demonstrate that. You should provide some basic author information. So what is your affiliation, your title, any relevant publications. You don't need to provide a CV, but you're basically just kind of demonstrating that you are a correct person to write this book. What is the book's market? So what is the readership, the level, and then what are the fields that will be of interest? Think in a way of doing this that is realistically expansive. So I find that I'm always in doubt when somebody tells me this book is going to be of interest to, and then rattles off like half a dozen fields, because it never really is the case. Think maybe at the subfield level. Again, using the sociology example, this book is going to be of interest to sociologists of culture, sociologists of economics, people who do stratification. Those are all interrelated areas within a field. And the level of readership too. This is where you can kind of talk about, I think that this book is really going to be appropriate for professionals and graduate students, or this is a book that is a textbook for teaching intro to theory students. And again, there's no right or wrong answer. There just needs to be a match between what you're doing and what you say you're doing. The specifications, what is the length? We think in publishing of books in terms of word length. The best books are usually somewhere between, I would say, 50 to 100,000 words. That'll give you a book that is somewhere between 200 pages at a 5.5 by 8.5 trim size to, on the far side, say 300 pages at 6 1/8, 9 1/4. And those are kind of generally a good size. They're relatively easier to price, and you have a little bit of flexibility within on the page in terms of how you can kind of space things out and give a comfortable reading experience. Much smaller, it becomes actually really tricky because you just have to sell a lot of books at like $9.95 to be able to, kind of make a case for doing something. And then when books become much longer, they become difficult, and bookstores often, have doubts about carrying a book that's, say, $45. We'll see if that changes over time, but that's an issue. Does your book include illustrations, and what kind of illustrations? Are they line, black and white, color, photos? If color, publishers assume black and white printing. If you need color, make sure you're upfront about that and what those needs might be. Schedule, when do you expect that you would be able to deliver a final manuscript? Probably is not ideal for me to say this, but books never come in on time. And so I almost always will suggest that we think like 1 year out. Manuscript is due in a year, and then 9 months happen, and the author and I check in, and all right, let's just move that out another 6 months, or so forth. And everything always just takes longer to do. And I think if you're not an author by trade, that's not your primary job, it becomes like the second or third thing on the list, and it gets bumped. And I accept that. It happens. And again, this is another. If you're submitting to multiple publishers, let the editor know. Other materials to include, if you have sample chapters, I think it's really helpful. Sample chapters that are kind of the substantive chapters. Unlike a dissertation, you should never have a literature review chapter. You can build elements of that into your introduction. So I would say your kind of chapter 2, chapter 3 are good ones to include, where you really are kind of showing how you're doing the work. Introductions should be written last. And the introduction that comes in with a proposal, or even with a final manuscript, often get changed. Introduction is really the most important thing that you do. And then the final thing I'll talk about is just what should you consider. So your publisher has got your proposal, they've sent it out for review, it's been approved by the faculty, you've written your response, it's been approved by the faculty board, and they send you a contract. And we always send authors our boilerplate contract and say, go ahead, look at this, review it, and then mark up any changes that you want. I mean, the rationale for this, there's a kind of behavioral economics element to this, which is basically like, in terms of negotiation, I don't know what's important to you. So I would rather you tell me what's important rather than me guess what you think is important, and then we can make changes such that we're giving you what you want. Here are some of the elements that are typically negotiable that I think are really important for you to focus on. So the word count. This is one that's important. If your book is going to, you really know it's going to take you 130 or 100,000 words to make your argument, and your contract says 80,000 words, that's one where you want to raise some questions, because you want to make sure that you have enough space with which to do your writing. The word count is all the words. So footnotes count in there, references count in there. So it's everything. Usually there's an allowance in a publisher contract for percentage over the word count. So if it's 5% over or 10% over, it's fine. Generally, I haven't experienced too many cases where things are like wildly over that it's really problematic, but it does happen. The delivery date. What are the expectations of when you're going to be delivering that final manuscript, and is that realistic? Even though I said everything comes in late, you can start out with a reasonable date. Is not a bad thing. What are the approval requirements? So if you're submitting your book based on a proposal, and the proposal has the proposal been approved by a faculty board? Is it what's often called a non-board approved contract, meaning that the final manuscript will get reviewed and then the committee will approve it there? What are the requirements that the press may have of you to get the final manuscript into production? The finances. So books are, as an author, you're paid a royalty. And the royalty for academic books is typically a net percentage, say 10% net on all sales. And that net is based on the price that the publisher sells the book to bookstores. And you'll have royalties that are different based on the format. So there's a cloth royalty, there's a paperback royalty, and an ebook royalty. Ebook royalties are always done on net terms, and ebook, kind of typical academic book ebook royalty is about 15%. Subrights. So what are the subrights? Mean like translation rights for translation, audiobook, which is becoming more and more important. Again, depending on the audience, this may or may not be relevant, but it's something to look at. And then an advance. Or most cases for academic books, an advance isn't paid, but I find that advances can be helpful for helping to cover some initial costs that you may have in producing the book. Do you need to do some research that's going to cost you some amount of money that you don't have funds from your institution to cover? An advance can be helpful in that. And I usually will ask people, when they're asking for an advance, what is it going to be used for, so that we can determine if it's an appropriate amount to do what that person is aiming to do. You want to make sure that your editor, through conversation, really understands what your book is about, and that you're on the same page and you have the same aims for the publication of the book. I think this is really important because your editor is going to be your advocate for you throughout the course of the publishing process. There are different stages of the book's publication in which the editor is not the frontline person. During production, you're going to have a production editor. During the marketing of the book, you're going to have a publicist. But your editor is that person who's with you from the start to the end, and is always, even in those other stages, is in the background. And you want to make sure that your editor is going to be a really good advocate for you. The prestige of the press. If you're kind of weighing two different contract offers, are these presses that seem to have the same reputation within your field? I've had instances, and so in coming to Columbia, the sociology list is relatively new, and I experienced, especially when I first started, where I had projects that were revised dissertations where I had an author or prospective author say to me, I have two authors and my tenure committee is recommending that I take this other offer because that other publisher has been in the field for a much longer amount of time. And I certainly understand that at the time. I don't think that's quite the same anymore, but there are all kinds of different reasons for publishing books, and you want to make sure that you're not kind of making some kind of mistake in the professionalization and that component of the book for your career. What is the marketing strategy for the book? So this is, and I should say too, these kind of last elements are not things that are necessarily going to be in the contract, but they're things that you just want to have in conversation with the editor before you sign one. So what's the marketing strategy of the book? How is the press viewing this particular publication? Are they going to do kind of an expensive cloth only edition that's intended for libraries? Are they going to do it as a simultaneous cloth and paperback? Are they going to do it as a relatively less expensive hardcover, kind of aimed at a more general audience? What is the publisher's plans? And do those plans match what your interests and expectations are for that book? And different publishers, based on their lists, will see the same book in wildly different kinds of ways. So a book that is a trade general interest book for a smaller regional university press would be something that might be a real kind of scholarly monograph for a kind of a larger publisher. Every publisher has slightly different lists, and you want to know where you're kind of fitting into that, and that it matches what your interests are. And finally, the publication timing. So get a sense of from the time that you deliver your final manuscript, how long is it going to take for that to become a book in the bookstore, and make sure you're on the same page that that's going to work. Again, for things like professionalization, if you need to make sure that your book is on the shelves or at the academic conference by a certain date, and the publisher is not able to meet that date, and that's going to cause problems for you for job retention, make sure that you are conveying that information and that the publisher can meet those expectations. And that is that's what we have for now. So thank you. Thank you. So
we have some time for questions, both from people here and in the live stream. And I want to remind everyone, this is a great opportunity. The publishing process is usually very opaque, and you have here someone who really understands it and is happy to share what he knows. So please take advantage of this opportunity. We'll start with Tom. Yep. All right. So.
Thanks. This is really clear and illuminating.
Oh, good.
I'm curious about one piece. I'm sure I'm not alone in the room in thinking that open access is really important.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how y'all work to bring really important academic work to the world through ebooks and other kinds of more accessible forms.
Yeah, that's a great question. So different university presses have different relationships to open access. I would say that it's probably, it's pretty fluid at the moment. The university presses that have either some kind of a state mandate towards open access or are part of a library are generally more on the forefront of open access. Two publishers that I think of as being particularly good with regards to kind of pushing open access platforms and trying to come up with a model that works for open access are MIT Press and University of Michigan Press. And then University of California Press is another that's similar. We report to the provost's office, and there's been really kind of less interest in kind of us developing a open access model at the moment. So we kind of haven't really been that progressive and are waiting, I think, for others to kind of come up with a system that works so that we can then get behind. That said, we participate in programs like JSTOR and De Gruyter. There's Oxford's Scholarship Online is another case where these are not necessarily open access platforms in the sense that your university library or institution has to be a member of one of these collections. But if you have a university affiliation, you're able to get online and electronic material pretty easily as if it were open access. Sure.
Matt's book, you can actually read it online, right? And I've seen like couple others are also doing that. Like, how's the decision being made, and do you think it will affect sales?
That's a great question. So, I think that we're in the experimental phase right now. So, it's hard to determine whether or not something is affecting sales or not, because in our side, at least as a publisher, it's kind of still more or less a counterfactual. But I think that actually, like, online engagement is actually really important. And we have a number of projects that we've published. We started a series with Public Books where the first two books that were published, one is called Think in Public, which is basically a collection of essays that have appeared on Public Books and still appear on Public Books. And another one is called Anti-Democracy in America, which is a collection of essays that was part of their Big Picture series. All that material is online. And if somebody wanted to go read individual pieces, you could. And so I think that there's a value in having a physical copy of something, and in essence, that's what you're paying for. And our bargain is that there's going to be enough people who want to do that to help to cover the fixed costs. There definitely is a discoverability component to it too. So we worked with Dana Fisher on a book called American Resistance, where she wrote chapters and put them up online as she was writing them, and they still remain online. They'll be published obviously in an edited version. But she was on Morning Joe multiple times. She's been interviewed for The Monkey Cage and all kinds of places that I don't think would have ever gotten her attention in quite the same way had she not been that way. So I think that we're still figuring out the model. Yeah.
A little bit, Eric, I have to use the mic for the. Thank you. So Eric mentioned that it's important for you to say what is important for you when you're working with an editor. And so if this is something that's really important for you, I would encourage you to say it. And then the second thing is try to work with the editor to understand what your editor's goals are. So for example, I never said I'm making my book available for free, because that is a word that generates some concern, because your editor needs to have a salary and have health insurance and all of these things. And so I thought of it, I tried to explain how I thought it was a great opportunity to increase the impact of the book, increase the quality of the book, and increase the access to knowledge. But that was really a third thing. And then about data, so I have a bunch of data that I collected from the open review of Bit by Bit about how we were able to higher quality, higher sales, increased access to knowledge. I've posted those on the Princeton University Press blog. So you can go through, and I try to make the case specifically for things that both the authors and the editors care about. So both care about better books, both care about higher sales, and both care about increased access to knowledge.
I think that's right, yeah. I think we're kind of figuring out the model right now. And I think that part of the problem that the model has at the moment is that it does require the author to come up with funds to make something open access. So it means that only those authors who are at institutions that have sufficient resources are going to be able to do that. And that's problematic.
So I'm in social psychology, so I'm curious as to how fields that are more focused on incremental journal articles, how those do or don't translate to academic press books.
That's a great question. Yeah, so I think that they can be challenging insofar as what you need to do is find the through line to those different articles. So I wouldn't recommend necessarily publishing a collection of articles, but is there, after you've published, a dozen articles, what is the through line? What is the big question and answer that is being asked by this body of work that you have? And can that become a book such that each of those individual chapters may be based on an article? But as a whole, everything kind of hangs together. I find, I don't anymore, but I used to work with neuroscientists. Neuroscience was my other field. And that was something that I often posed to neuroscientists, which was, this is a field that's not a book field. And oftentimes people go into research with a particular, with the idea of asking some big question, where's the mind come from, or something like that. And then they find that they're doing, studies on different neurons in the retina. And, pull yourself back from the article level, and what is that larger question, and can you ask that question and answer that question? Yeah.
So we have a question from Sifan from our RTI location. He asks, could you talk more about the peer review process for a book, maybe by comparing it to the journal peer review process? For instance, what if the two reviewers have totally opposite ideas for a project? Is there an R&R sort of thing for book peer review? Is meeting reviewers' comments the necessary condition to get accepted, though you already said meeting these conditions is not the sufficient condition?
Yep. That's a great question. I think that I was talking with Matt about this earlier. We've kind of come to discover this year, just through collecting the data, that only about 12% of the projects that are submitted to us are ultimately get published or get contracted. So it's a fairly low acceptance rate. And at a book publisher, editors really think more in terms of kind of list building than we do in terms of like pure theoretical novelty, that I think is what articles are looking for. And we're looking for, we're looking for somebody to be able to tell a story in the course of that book. So there are the expectations and the demands of the expectations of the author are different for books. So we have a different kind of criteria than we would for articles. And R&R is really not a desirable outcome. We want things to be kind of approved on the first go. The way in which I ask authors often to write their author response, I think, will be indicative of how how that process works. So what I usually we'll have two reports, and I usually will ask the author and think about it as a 5-paragraph essay. First paragraph, thanking the reviewers and kind of signaling an understanding of the value of the review process. The second paragraph is, what is the through line that exists between both of these reports? What are the things that both readers kind of have in common, pro and con? What are things that, then the next paragraph, what are things that reviewer A talks about? Next paragraph, what are things that reviewer B talks about? And how are you going to address those kinds of things or not? You have a lot more flexibility to say, hey, I don't think that reviewer A is really getting what I'm after here, but that may mean that you're not as clear as you think that you want to. So it's often less about, is this actually making a contribution, as I think is the case with articles, than am I conveying this in a way that is right? And then the final paragraph, just kind of summing things up and talking about what you're actually going to do to address those issues. So I hope that answers that question.
I have two very short questions.
Uh-huh.
So one is about what you think, what makes introduction nearly good introduction for the book project. So I'm in PhD program in political science and hoping to turn into my dissertation into book project in the future. And so that's why the question came from. And the other question is about, I'm writing 3-paper dissertation, which is kind of becoming common in poli sci, econ, and so on. And I guess that you have experience with people who done that. Yeah. And so what's your advice for it?
Yep. So let's see. So on the first question, what makes for a good introduction? So the metaphor I like to use is to think of the introduction as a vestibule, right? So it is basically the part of the house in which you're bringing people in, you're acclimating them to what this house is like, but you're not actually like giving them a tour of room by room, right? You're kind of giving them a bit of a flavor and stoking their interest, and they want to know then what is behind this front door, and that's I think a good way to think about it. Something also too that I like to suggest to people in what I mentioned before about don't have a literature review, but talk about the lineage within which your project may be part of. So in an example would be, we published a book by Kat Turco at MIT called The Conversational Firm, which was about a social media company. And it's really ultimately about bureaucracy in organizations and when you try to have an organization that has a flat hierarchy and get rid of bureaucracy, what are the things that actually just are sticky about bureaucracy and remain? And she talks about Weber, she talks about Robert Merton, and then she talks about her project as being a new way to think about bureaucracy because the times have changed. So that's a good way, I think, of doing that connectivity without doing like I know all these things about all these books that is kind of required for a dissertation. The 3-paper problem is a tricky one. So can one of those 3 papers be expanded in some way? So often I think that people who have a revised dissertation can often be at a disadvantage or like a proper, single dissertation can often be at a disadvantage because the revision of that project is a particularly difficult kind of work because there's so much that's within your dissertation that is being fed to the different members of your committee and actually is not there because it makes complete sense as a whole, right? So what you actually really want to focus on the question and the answer. And oftentimes the dissertation doesn't have that same tightness. There also can be ways in which your dissertation is kind of written in the style or the voice of your advisor, not even by accident, but that's just a sort of your learning. And starting a project wholly anew is an opportunity to write something in your voice that you have now.
I'm just curious, what do you look at with regard to appendices, what role do they play within the context of sort of the expectation of the book? And then also on this, has there been a turn recently, just given the sort of proliferation within articles, to online appendices, and then do those count toward the sort of required word count?
Sure. So material that's online would not count towards your word count. So that's a good thing. Let's see. That's a good. I honestly don't give appendices tremendous amount of thought beyond a methods appendix, and that typically for people who do ethnographic work. But I think actually a methods appendix can be really helpful and important in just kind of explaining, how you've gone about and done the work. It does allow you, if you have like a lot of regression tables or things that would just be difficult for a reader who is not, kind of in a sub-discipline with you to engage with, that's when we often will say, hey, just if you can move this to the appendix just so that it doesn't interrupt the flow. But yeah, that's kind of methods appendix. I think is really useful. But
hi. So I wanted to follow up on the question of like dissertations that turn into books. So I'm curious if you have any advice for like how one might go about planning the dissertation project in a way that will make it sort of like flow better into the book, and if like you have any thoughts on like when we can or should start talking to editors.
Sure. So that's a very good question. I think that on the how to make a dissertation that will flow more into a book. I mean, I often get people who say to me, "Oh, my advisors told me to write this like a book, but it still isn't really." So I would say the thing that is important is again the focus on the question and the answer to the question, and even if during the course of the dissertation writing process you have to move away from that, know how you can kind of go back to that. What is the core? What is the core idea that you want to talk about, and what is that core motivation? And I think if you can hold on to that, it'll help you to just kind of strip things away when it comes time. So when is the best time to approach an editor? Often when you really feel like you have a good case to make. I was telling Matt earlier too that I find, to me, it's through referral is like the number one way that leads to something that's actionable. And it could be somebody's advisor or colleague saying, hey, you should check out this person or connect with that person, or that person emailing me and saying, hey, such and such suggested I reach out to you. And it is a relatively small community, and relationships matter. And even when people say to me, hey, I'm not really ready to do anything with this, but would you be willing to meet up with me and talk about this? I would say do that. I mean, you don't have to like feel like. I would say also too, the other editors may disagree with this, but I don't think that you only have like one shot at something. Like, I find often there are a number of authors that I can think of where the project came about through just successive conversations. We'll meet each year at ASA, and maybe year 4 something actually happens with it. So think about that as a kind of as a dialogue, and it isn't like, here's my shot, and if they don't bite on it now, I'm done for. Yeah.
Hey, thanks. So you'd mentioned both fame and tenure as reasonable justifications for writing a book.
Mm-hmm.
How could we think about a trade-off when we're trying to write the book? So does it make sense to try to accomplish both tasks, or is that usually sort of doomed to failure?
It's good. Yeah. I think it can be difficult for most people, right? I think it can be really difficult for most people because I think that the professional expectations of contribution are often at odds with communicating to the level of audience that's required for a book to actually be particularly successful. This would be a rare case, like Seamus Khan's Privilege, for instance, is an example of what's effectively a revised dissertation that got attention, won awards, and has sold well, and it gets adopted. That's an ethnography of a school. It is a particular type of project. I think most scholarly books don't have that level of interest to a wider audience. I mean, the way I often think about that is that if you have to explain to somebody why this question is being asked in the first place, there's limitations on the audience. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about like the finances in terms of like how much are people actually making off of books?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. So the answer is it really depends on sales, right? So if a book you're getting paid on royalties, and so let's say you have a book that is priced at $30 as a paperback. You're getting paid in net royalties at 10%. And the book is being discounted 50% to the bookstore. So it's a few dollars per book. And if you're selling only, 200, 300 copies, it doesn't really add up to a tremendous amount. So I would say in the low 4 figures. But that said, that's your typical kind of scholarly monograph. Books that sell year in and year out, or sell a lot of copies in the beginning, you can actually make quite a decent amount of money. You can also kind of so the route that I'm talking about too is for scholarly books and university presses. There's also a whole area of publishing which is called trade publishing. So these are books that are written for bookstores. Often an author will have an agent. The agent will represent the author and sell that book to the publisher. The agent's goal is really to try to get as large an advance as is possible. The advance are basically an advance on royalties, on future royalties, and so you can get a decent sized advance. And sometimes the book does what we call earn out, meaning that the royalties cover that advance. There are other cases where the royalties basically never cover that full amount of the advance. So it depends on the kind of publishing that you're involved with and what your aims are. So as I mentioned before, at university press level, our goal is contribution. And there isn't always a lot of money in contribution. But trade publishers are interested in selling, they want to sell as many copies of books as they possibly can. And as a result, their expectations of you as an author are going to be different. They're not going to care about the contribution. They're going to say, we need you to write something that's saleable. And I think that different people over the course of their career can actually engage with the different kinds of publishing streams at different times. And especially if you go into a project and say, this is an idea that I care about, but I don't care enough about it that taking the advice of the editor to really kind of jazz it up and make it such that it's really going to be saleable is a problem, then trade route is a good way for you. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a pretty basic question. I often see in the acknowledgement section of the book that people they thank their editors.
Yeah.
But it's for me. I haven't published a book yet, and for me it's pretty difficult to understand what help can you expect from the good editor.
Yeah. Just
what to look for, what is normal and what is not normal.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think, and there are different. It's different between editor, and it may even be different between editor and editor even at the same publisher. So I think there are, I would say, on the minimalist side, managing the peer review would be kind of perceived as like the editor's contribution, and kind of making sure that you are getting the appropriate level of peer reviewers who are going to be able to understand the manuscript and help you to both get through the process, but also get the kind of advice and help that you will need and will benefit from. To the far extreme side of an editor doing kind of line by line, copy edits to your manuscript. I find for myself personally, I have projects that, and even in the same year, that will go from one extreme to the other. There are some authors that I know who really don't want much editor involvement. There are others who kind of need it. I have a book right now, a manuscript right now, where I am literally going through each chapter and almost rewriting it at a sentence-by-sentence level. I had another book in the springtime where I basically did the same thing. There are other projects where I didn't do a whole heck of a lot because it just wasn't required. And so I think the key, and when we were talking before about fit, what you want to do is make sure that you and the editor are on the same page about what they're going to do. And I really do like and appreciate when prospective authors ask me, what can I expect? What are you going to do? And what I usually tell them is, what do you want? What do you think is necessary? And then let's figure out a way to make sure that you're getting what you need, so that we're bringing that value add. For me, the thing that is the trick for me that is the best is when, and this works more with local authors than otherwise, is setting up like a meeting. So like, let's meet in 3 weeks. Send me what you have right now. Let's meet in 3 weeks, and then just sitting down and having a conversation about, what's been written and what's been read, and that's a good way for me to work. Sorry.
Okay, these will be the last things because we're a little bit behind.
Hi. So it's more like a general question. So do you have any advice or experience working with non-native English speakers, in terms of what are the specific concerns that you have, or that you suggest non-native English speakers, authors also to have, and if they need to go to other process of revising the work before submitting, how is your experience?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I would say, I have lots of experience working with non-native English speakers. I think the thing that often comes across with non-native English speakers is things that are just kind of idiomatically off, where you can sort of see on the page the person thinking in their primary language, and then it's written in English. You can work with, ideally, if the funds are available for you, work with a developmental editor who can basically kind of help get that manuscript into shape. All publishers, every manuscript gets a copy edit, and so when I have a case where there's a non-native English speaker I'll always alert the production department and the production editor and the copy editor and say, we have a book by a non-native English speaker, so to be on the lookout for different kinds of idiomatic oddities. I mean, I find in some cases, like in French, I think like academic English speakers are used to sort of like French English, like French translated English, and so there's a charming quality to that. I mean, I may be a group of one in believing that, but it also comes across as authentic. We don't expect that a person who's a native French speaker who lives in Paris to speak New York English, and so it comes across more authentically. The same thing too with like British English and American English. Whenever I have an author from the UK, I always want it to be copy edited in British English because that's how the person talks.
So since this is the Summer Institute in Computational Social Science, I wanted to ask if you could think of any books, either by CUP or other presses, that you thought did an especially good job of like communicating a computational analysis in the book.
That's a good question. Matt's book? I genuinely believe that. I think Matt's book does that particularly well. I mean, I think that the thing that makes computational books tricky, but I think also kind of interesting, is that you need to be able to translate math into language. And in the same way that I think translating like science into language can be done in a really interesting way, I think the same so for computational work. So one way to really think about how to do that is to really walk the reader through the process of how the work is done, because I think also too a lot of it, and I know this really more through kind of working with Chris, is that so much of the work is you come up with an interesting question, and then you have to figure out how actually am I going to be able to get the answer to this question. And the process, I find in conversation, the process of talking to Chris about how he comes up with this stuff is actually really interesting. And it also then provides an opportunity for someone else to be able to take that and then run with it themselves. I'll kind of finish on a kind of conclusion. So we talked a bit about what does a good introduction do. What does a good conclusion do? A good conclusion sums everything up at the end. It talks a little bit about here's what you've learned in these various chapters, but then proposes what can come next. Based on what you know and what you've learned now, here are a few different ideas and concepts that you can kind of run with and do your own project. And I think that the more that computational books can do that, because you guys are really at the forefront of social science, you'll provide the opportunity for that next generation to be able to push the field even further.
All right. On that note of forward looking, let's thank Eric.